Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Whether you're tuning in from the Gulf, Europe, or further afield, we're glad to have you with us. My name is David Lomax. I head up the sales engineering team here at Abnormal across EMEA. I'll be your moderator for the next 45 minutes. Quick housekeeping, we're going to run a moderated discussion for the first 25 minutes. There will be a Q&A. We reserved some time at the end of that. Please drop any questions into the Q&A panel as well, which should be enabled now. I'll moderate those and look through those as we're going through. But more importantly, our guests here today, I am joined with Patti. Maybe over to you to quick introduction on yourself, please.
Yeah, Patti Titus. I'm the field CISO here at Abnormal. I've been with the company about a year. Prior to that, I was a 25-year veteran CISO in Fortune 500 and public sector. So happy to be here and happy to join the conversation.
Thank you, Patti. Maybe Piotr, can you introduce yourself as well?
Absolutely. Thank you, David. My name is Piotr. I'm the head of threat intel here at Abnormal. I've been with the company for 18 months now. Prior to that, done quite a bit of incident response, threat hunting, and threat intelligence across the industry. So excited to have this conversation with all of you today.
Perfect. Thank you. Appreciate both of you being here today. So just to set the scene, we're going to cut through the noise to focus on the three critical shifts we've seen that can impact your defensive position, right? The rules of engagement, we're going to go through current escalations differ from 19 to 22 activity, the challenges of defending against potentially decentralized acts of resistance, people that are operating on a shared ideology rather than central command. We're going to talk around the battle for the inbox, evolving tradecraft being used from slow socially engineered attacks, destructive wipers, real-time phishing kits. And then we're going to try and translate that into an action. We'll talk about how can CISOs proactively communicate that geopolitical intelligence and the threat and understand the surge and what they can do to protect against that. Obviously, the goal of this is to define what these shifts mean to your detection, triage, and identity security strategies today. So with that in mind, I'm going to drop into a few of the questions we've got in. And first question, Piotr, I'm going to go to yourself first. In your recent research on the Iran-aligned cyber operations, what's the most important ways this escalation differs from previous Iranian activity, remembering back from like 2019 to 22?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, what I would probably point out to is that I believe that we're looking at a much bigger conflict, which ultimately has a much bigger response and much bigger scale to it. So when we look at even the 12-day war that happened last year, we're looking at a specific operation that was targeted mostly around the nuclear program. And now what we can pretty much look at is that we have not only operation that scale in terms of depending on the signals and the wording of people behind it, but also looking for potential change of regime, which became a little bit more about survival than just the program itself, which obviously in response had a much bigger scale to that, because when you're fighting for survival, that's a completely different approach. But also how that became how that conflict then also expanded into the region and pulled in additional entities around region, which we haven't seen really in the prior activity. But ultimately from cyber operations, so that geopolitical context in mind, what we're looking at in terms of cyber operations and how does that differ is one, the scale of response not only has been much faster, and those playbooks in terms of groups mobilizing to respond to that threat has been much faster than historically. The amount of activity has been bigger. As well as we're seeing some interesting use cases where obviously we had the one big wiper accident that pretty much everyone knows about because it was publicly in the news. But this is just an indication of those threat groups looking for activity that is notable, that is in the headlines, that is in the news, really to spread fear and put pressure on everyone who's involved in this conflict. But I think one key piece that we're also seeing is that we have a pretty much interesting portfolio of cyber operations. So obviously we have nation states and typical threat groups associated with the government that will still perform strategic objectives. And then we have a number of groups that pretty much is aligned with with this particular government based on the ideology and what they believe in. And those hacktivist groups, those groups were mobilized and they operate outside of this typical nation state corpus. So that pretty much brings to the table a new set of techniques, new set of attacks. Also groups that can pretty much operate across certain borders because they don't care about deniability of those attacks, so they can pretty much do much bigger harm. And also we're seeing a little bit of a interesting twist and kind of like the nation state and e-crime ecosystem merging, where we see access brokers and we see buying access, where we see leveraging tools that are usually available more in the e-crime marketplace, and then leveraging those for further attacks that are more aligned with the government priorities and the nation state priorities of Iran. So it's a very interesting mix of both hacktivist groups, nation state groups, and e-crime all operating in one form or another as a cooperation in line with the strategic objectives of the government in response to the conflict.
Okay, no, very interesting. Yeah, it's certainly evolved over the last few years, I'm sure. Patti, maybe from a CISO's perspective, how are you translating this kind of geopolitical intelligence into, concrete action for your boards and executives, obviously without creating some sort of panic or alert fatigue at the top?
Yeah, so that's a challenge, right? So everybody's super hyper focused on what's happening and the supply chain issues that are starting to have ripple effects across the globe. So first of all, our job is not to be the person who sounds the alarm. It's really the person that helps convert signal to decision. So CISOs need to walk in with a risk posture and a very specific ask, not a threat dump. So that's like number one. Your job is to not spread fear, but rather cut to the chaff and talk about the risk to the corporation. I'd recommend that the Abnormal did Abnormal AI did a Venom report, and I think that should be a prerequisite that could be uploaded to your board or executive read ahead documentation. So that's a really great document and goes into a lot of detail that I think can allay a lot of the fear. So you got to discuss the threat environment where nation state actors are targeting executive identities and credentials as a primary vector. So Iran and affiliate groups have used credential theft and identity abuse extensively. Separately, the Venom report shows us that this capability has been commoditized into a platform and is available to multiple operators. So unfortunately, that means that it's easily accessible by the threat actors. Hardening executive identity is a response to both. So be prepared with who are your regional suppliers. Look at the supply chain ties and what is your unvalidated continuity, which means what do I know? Now I need to look at what I don't know. So really dig into the supply chain that are in that local region, and then understand the weakness of your identity controls. Those are the risk multipliers. So be prepared when you come into the room with the right data points, and sometimes it's really hard for CISOs to stay in our swim lane. Try not to speculate and try to keep it very fact-based and what you know versus what you don't know. And you need to be really transparent, especially if you're not running exercises on continuity of operations. You need to be very transparent with what that could mean and what that risk ripple effect could have on the company and survivability, which is unfortunately what this discussion is really about.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Patti. Piotr, you described earlier about these more than 70 groups operating under the Axis of Resistance banner, more rather than a centrally coordinated command structure. Is that what we're really seeing, a form of ethical alignment, groups that share ideology and a target list but operate independently? Also, if that is so, what does this actually make? Does this actually make them harder to defend against from the traditional top-down operations? How should we change the way we security teams approach that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and ultimately, I believe that what we're looking at is more of a hybrid between the two, where we don't really, have one single central command with all those groups being, being tasked daily with here's a list of things and here's a list of objectives, go and conquer. Um, but we did definitely, I think, see a playbook for response that pretty much created, motivated, and had a set of um, aligned groups ready to respond if should the conflict start. And at the same time, we do have a number of activist groups that pretty much perform outside of boundaries and without that central coordination in support of the wider conflict. So it reminds me a little bit of or maybe the audience will also remembers, the any form of like anonymous operations when they were like collecting specific individuals against government entities. I think in this particular case, the similarity is more about like how some of those activists and hacktivist groups come together to support the bigger ideology. But at the same time, I think the key difference that I would draw here is that the response playbook in terms of high level response, high level targets, type of attacks, as well as the playbook in terms of attacks has been pre-established and has been most likely pre-established by the government itself and by the Iranians in preparation for potential need to respond. But to your point, it still doesn't really change. We don't want to spend too much time on is this the model A and B and speculate because that ultimately the key thing here is that it does create a much higher level of difficulty when it comes to defending. Because we're not looking at like, threat actor A or technique ABC and, we check it off your list and then like, hey, we're secure. So it does create a situation in which we're pretty much looking at the entire stack of attacks, whether those attacks come from a leverage email for initial access, whether that's spraying intra tenants or cloud tenants, and and trying to obtain a foothold through password attacks, whether that's acquiring or leveraging credentials that are already available on ECRM markets, whether that's deploying RRM tools on the back of email attacks or custom payloads. There's different, almost looking at what different groups bring to the table. We're looking at pretty much every type of attack that you can think of in terms of what is available out there. And what that ultimately means is that from a detection standpoint, you can't look at it as an isolated incident. You have to look at it through the lens of like, okay, is my entirety of my stack and my security program mature enough to handle the entire set of attacks that those groups are bringing forward. So I think the key piece here is that yes, it absolutely makes it harder to defend. And when it comes to detection implications, I will be the first one who always point to threat intelligence and bringing intelligence into your stack to be better informed. And at the same time, when we look at the scale of the attacks and the type of attacks, we're pretty much looking at the entire plethora of what's available out there in terms of how attackers can gain access and then monitor and then create impact on the back of that access. And we've already had some of the examples documented both publicly as well as, based on some of the intelligence sharing some additional insights in terms of what those attacks look like. And that ultimately means that, yes, the defenders have to pretty much focus on the entirety of the stack and focus on ensuring that the maturity of their stack is what will allow them ultimately to defend from this threat.
Okay, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, not an easy task. I guess flipping that back to you, Patti, how would you, from a top-down perspective, how are you going to tell your boards, your security teams, they should defend against this based on, Piotr's clearly approach of look at everything, right? How do you maintain the level of security you're going to be expected to provide to the board when it is quite such a broad spectrum of attacks now?
Yeah. Yeah, I think Piotr covered a lot of territory there. So I think, I mean, obviously, we want our teams to be on alert and responsive and paying attention. Threat intelligence is super important for a team. Picking and choosing is not, in this environment, I think you don't really have the opportunity to pick and choose what you're going to go after. And this is where having broad understanding, so having your threat intelligence team briefing the other elements of your security program is really important. And a lot of CISOs don't connect the dots because maybe their GRC team aren't as technical as other teams. But I think your threat intelligence team needs to be able to communicate what they're seeing so that it puts everybody on heightened alert, not just your SOC team. And that I think is a critical flaw that CISOs make. And to be honest with you, those threat intelligence teams aren't necessarily geared for communicating a level down to someone who maybe is a layman. And so I think that's another critical area that needs to be covered. Um, the attacks, it's hard to watch everything, but I think this is the time when, it's all hands on deck, and people have to be super hyper vigilant.
No, I think that's some very good advice from them. That really makes a lot of sense. Piotr, when we look at things like Muddy Water, APT42, and Void Manticore, they all use email in very different ways, from that slow, socially engineered attack to destructive wipers. Which one of these tradecraft patterns are you most worried about in the next 3 to 6 months, and why?
That's David, it's an interesting question because I think ultimately what we're looking at is like when we dive a little bit more deeper into specific threat groups and kind of where they operate the most, we would see, let's take Muddy Water. We would see, that group potentially leveraging quite extensively, email to get access into the environment, really, really operating at scale of like getting access and pretty much harvesting that access for then further usage down the road, whether it's for that group or other groups. We might be looking at then a completely different approach to obtaining access by different groups where they would be targeting specific individuals and pretty much not just sending emails but really building the relationship through conversation, whether they're targeting researchers that might be associated with nuclear programs or politicians or journalists. Those will be conversations maybe through WhatsApp, maybe through outreach, through text messages that will pretty much building a relationship before the actual attack happens. So very slow targeting that ultimately delivers the payload. And then we might be looking at groups that like Handala, who are responsible for actual wiping and destruction. When we look at that activity also, it's not like it just happens overnight. It's not like someone just lands on a critical system that allows you to just destroy the entire infrastructure and then push a button. So that there's an entire amount of activity that has to happen first in terms of both obtaining access, then escalating privileges, then moving laterally, getting to the point of being able to actually create that destruction. So that ultimately, if you look at those different groups, that gives you perspective into like they all operate differently. So when I think about like what is that one thing, I don't want to give I almost don't want to answer that question for lens of like, hey, there's this one thing that I'm concerned about, and then for people to take that away and just focus purely on that. But what I will say is that the key thing for me is that we're seeing a very wide portfolio of techniques, attacks, and capabilities, whether that's multi chain and level attacks, like mentioned, like it might start with a mobile device and then turn into some form of a phish kit and delivery of a payload. We're seeing attacks in which compromised accounts can be then used for lateral phishing attempts, whether it's inside of the organization or across the organization where a trusted element is already established. We're obviously seeing this interesting shift more towards cloud and identity, where when we look at that wiping incident again, the pretty much the wiper itself, it wasn't a piece of malware. It was an actual piece of technology that was leveraged and was just abused for specific wiping capability. And that also indicates that there's a very interesting focus towards, living off the land, living off the cloud, and really being able to live inside of that environment. But I think one of the pieces, if I were really pushed on this, not that you're pushing me hard on this question, like forcing me to answer that, but if I was one thing that I would call out, to me, like more than specific technique, the piece that underpins that is just the craziness and how AI is evolving. And how AI enables threat groups and nation states and attacks to become even more prolific and much faster. So if there's one thing that concerns me more than specific threat group or specific technique is the fact that, like, let's not pretend that threat actors are not leveraging AI to perform attacks, and let's not pretend that those attacks operate at a much different pace than what was historically happening. And there's already evidence that points to Iranian threat groups leveraging AI, whether it's for reconnaissance, whether it's performing shot on, enumeration of systems that can then allow them to get access, or actually pre-building malware capability for custom backdoors. They already leverage that capability, and some of that is publicly documented. The amount of that activity happening behind the scenes that we don't see and we don't have documented, I can only imagine, right? Like, I use the AI for day to day as a defender, as a person inside of threat intel. I don't want to pretend that, like, attackers are not leveraging that. So I think that piece ultimately, what this is my biggest concern is that the amount of techniques, the amount of attacks, the amount of threat groups behind, motivated to really ideologically motivated to support this specific conflict, enabled through that capability in the next 3 to 6 months. That's more of my concern, because that operates at a much different pace and much faster than what we can expect.
Yeah, that makes a huge amount of sense. I guess the reality is, like you said, the kill chain still exists for a reason, right? You still have to go through a set of actions. It's now the speed they can go through that, right? So these slower defenses, if you're not leveraging AI for defense, you won't be able to keep up with potentially some of the attacks, or the speed the kill chain will be processed than it used to be. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, moving away from C2 connections to more just logging on as you and then behaving badly makes a huge amount of sense. Um, Paddy, given things like APT42's real-time phishing kits can now, bypass traditional MFA, what does good enough in terms of identity protection look like right now? Realistically, for an enterprise, can they flip everyone to resistant phishing MFA overnight?
I think that's a huge challenge, right? So it would be great if everybody had adopted the zero trust mentality years ago. But you've got legacy systems, you got tech debt, it's prioritization. I think the first thing you need to do is focus on the key targets in your company. Those are usually your executives, or a specific part of your organization. It might be your finance department. Depending on what the motivation is of the threat actor, you have to look at your risk profile and determine, first of all, what's my threat surface and who's after me. And that should help drive who you're going to target. But I do think there are some things that you can do from a technical perspective. So FIDO2 hardware keys for C-level executives is the first one. That ensures that attacks can't intercept a hardware token. So that is one area you could look at from an investment perspective. Something a little less, I have to go buy something, is disable device code flow in M365 where it's not needed. This is challenging for a team because we like to set it and forget it. And in these environments, you have to start leveraging your architecture team to help you understand where you've got threats and gaps in your control framework. So the disabling the device code flow in M365 eliminates that second attack vector completely. The session anomaly detection is another one. That's a behavioral AI catches the account that's behaving inappropriately after compromise, even if authentication appears clean. So this is another great technology where, yes, we're using indicators of compromise constantly, TTPs, but we also need to start building a profile of what's good behavior across our environment. And when that behavior is not normal, it allows your people to focus on where should I be looking at, something's not right. And that's where behavioral AI can do it at speed, and it doesn't go to sleep at night, and it doesn't have to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning when there's something goes bump in the night. It's constantly monitoring that. So there's a couple of things there that hopefully are helpful. But I do think you have to try to pick your high value targets in your company. And unfortunately, that's usually your C-level executives. And they're usually the ones, unfortunately, that are a bit resistant to change. So giving them a new process that they have to follow may be met with resistance, but in some cases, it's non-negotiable.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And you're right. Having worked with CISOs before, sorry, CISOs, C-level before, it's not an easy thing to get them to change sometimes, that's for sure. Appreciate that. Piotr, historically, the Iranian responses are delayed, but given everything we're seeing right now and having entered this new phase of the war, how should CISOs and security leaders be communicating this to their organizations right now? So explaining it to them, it's coming, rather than when the surge really becomes undeniable or unsustainable.
Yeah, I think that, ultimately the important piece here is that, one, historically, yes, there might have been a little bit of a delay between the response. When we look at the activity in 2019, 2020, I don't the even after specific targeting of specific hits or specific bombing, specific like killing of high ranking individuals, that high impact response never truly really arrived. We had some instances with Iranians targeting Albania government and then pretty much creating some impact there, but there was never this the same level of response that we've seen today. And just based on researching the Telegram groups and looking at the activity between how quickly the teams and response, how quickly the groups responsible for those attacks spun up in response to the current conflict, that response was much faster. And even though the bombing and everything else that happened probably disrupted quite a lot of C2 and logistics inside of Tehran or inside of Iran when it comes to pretty much creating some disruption to the typical way they operate, we still seen quite a fast response there. So I don't think the hoping that it will be delayed is should be in any way, shape or form like a tactic or strategy. So one piece of recommendation, I think, when it comes to CISOs and what I would point to is that this activity brings to the table plethora and full portfolio of attacks across many different groups. So ultimately, to me, it's a little bit of a back to the basics conversation about your security program and the maturity of your security program. And ultimately, the way I like to think about it as well as like often communicate is that like it ultimately comes down to like your hygiene, your visibility, your ability to detect, and then ability to respond and remediate in time. And as simple as that sounds, that often underpins a lot of failures of security programs because some part of that is missed. So I think that there's a incredible amount of security practitioners and security leaders right now who know exactly what they have those gaps, and this is a good opportunity to really, use and have conversations about improving the security programs based on the activity that's happening right now, based on the gaps that they already know. And obviously, you don't know what you don't know. So for any of the activity that you might not be aware of, it will be an opportunity also to pretty much leverage some form of like behavioral understanding of what your current threat risk exposure looks like, as well as like assessment of your capability in terms of like, okay, where am I based on certain level of maturity, and then leverage that to create a roadmap for improvements. Unfortunately, I would hope that I can give you like a one simple answer, like, hey, then do this and then everything's okay. But that's not the world we live in. And cybersecurity is very dynamic. And unfortunately, the threats are changing overnight, especially these days with enablement of AI. So ultimately, what we have to look at is still go back to the basics, ensure that we have the capabilities that allow us to match the AI speed, and continuously improve our security program moving forward.
Okay. No, thank you. Appreciate that. Patty, very quickly from you before we get into the Q&A, what do you think you'd be doing to make sure the teams are ready to deal with this before the surge became a problem?
I think continuous pen testing. You've constantly got to be probing from an outside in, inside out. Um, you got to do continuous pen testing, and there's technologies out there now today that are making it much easier to do that. I also think you need to run different teams, so red team, blue team, purple team, They probably come up with a new color I don't know about, but you've got to be constantly pounding on your own front door to make sure that your defenses are good. And that also, like Piotr said, you got to continually add to that list of known things that we need to have on a roadmap to get fixed, and then you've got to reprioritize them based on criticality and your risk profile and your risk appetites. So something else that companies need to have a good handle on is, what is my risk appetite? What's my willingness to accept? And then what is my risk transfer? Am I relying totally on insurance, or do I really have a team of people that are smart and know what they're doing?
Great. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you to both of you. Like, these are really good insights, and appreciate you all putting the effort in here. Like, I've seen there's some questions building in the panel, so I'll go through some of those and direct them to, I think, probably makes a lot of sense. So, Patti, no surprise, a lot of these are, how do I do this as a CISO? But as a CISO, one of my concerns is whether we're still architecting security programs around perimeter era assumptions. Do you believe identity has effectively become the new critical infrastructure layer organizations should be protecting? I guess, Patti, that makes sense for you.
Yeah, I think identity has always been a problem, and we've not done a great job with it, to be quite honest. We've over entitled people. I don't think it's new critical, infrastructure layer. I think it's always been that. The challenge that we have as CISOs is sometimes we don't own it. Sometimes it's in the hands of IT. That is something that I would strongly suggest you work either very closely with the IT team that owns identity, or uh, not that we need more work, but I would actually request that it transition into the security team so that you've got tighter oversight. That's my opinion. Identity has been the bane of my existence as a CISO. I've had more significant deficiencies trending toward material weaknesses. More auditors have written me up because of identity challenges. And in those instances, sometimes I didn't own identity, but I got the finding. So that was leverage for me to go ask the CIO to shift that over to my department. If I'm going to get written up, I want to own the fix. So that's how I would handle it, is own identity, because it is the front door to your organization.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Seeing as this one's backed right onto this one and straight back to you, Patti. If you're advising the board today, what cyber resilience credibility would you classify as you said earlier, non-negotiable over the next 24 months, given the direction of the nation state threat activity?
I think you got to have immutable storage. So you need a way to recover when it happens, and that you need to have failure playbooks. We don't like to talk about failure as an organization. Our playbooks are really designed around response. Something's happened and we're responding to it. We need to be prepared for it's all gone sideways at one time. And I know that's hard to get your head wrapped around, but it also allows you to think about things you wouldn't normally think about. So normally we stay in our swim lane in cyber and we say, we're going to look at cyber defenses or IT defenses. So we're going to look at how we recover from a data breach. I think you need to start looking across your organization, because there's so many SaaS applications in your environment now. A catastrophic failure could happen through one of those SaaS providers. Are you prepared for that? And oftentimes it's, well, we've got to write a good contract. It isn't all about contracts. It's about, how do I pivot when there's a catastrophe? You may be all in one cloud vendor. You have concentration risk that you're not even really thinking about or putting on a roadmap. So several things you've got to look at. I think you got to have cyber resilience, which means you've got to think through recovering operations. A lot of us talk about it. Uh, you may have an IT department that flips a switch once in a while, but the way our systems are designed today, that's very complicated. And oftentimes you can't switch over to your alternate provider, because that would mean you wouldn't be able to recover and come back. So
Yeah, no, terrifying. I'm old enough to remember the days of tape storage when everything got
I
put on
love
a tape
tape.
backup. Exactly, put it on a tape, and then once being told, "Do we test you can restore from that?" Oh no, we don't do that. I was like, okay. One for you, Piotr. If the war continues for a lot longer, and this is a big question, how do you see the cyber threat evolving? What do you see is coming our way?
Yeah. Well, I think there's some definitely interesting observations just by the fact when we look at how Iranian government responded to the conflict. I think, the whole closure of Strait of Hormuz and really what's behind that is really like, choking a very important supply chain that affects global economy. So that gives us a some form of indication into like, potential strategy behind the actions. So what I would expect to see is, as the conflict, first of all, if the war doesn't end with a deal and we have some form of resurgence of bombing and conflict kind of like, continuing as it happened in the initial days. I would definitely expect, even higher rate of attacks and retaliation attacks when it comes to cyber. Definitely ones that will be again seeking media attention, seeking really putting the message out there that like no one is safe because ultimately it's all about fear mongering and creating that concept of fear inside of anyone who whether it's inside of US, inside of Israel, or inside of all the entities that are that are by unfortunately by proxy became part of that conflict in the Middle East. But now bringing them back to the conversation about supply chain, what I would expect also is doubling down on other areas where supply chain can be affected, where global economy might be affected. So we're looking at potential attacks at supply chain vendors, financial institutions. We're looking at logistic providers. So if the core of the conflict and the ability for Iran to like pretty much have any any cards kind of on their side, an advantage on their side comes down to the fact that they are able to affect global economy right now, saving and the gas prices that are very important. So I think that's where we would be looking at cyber operations that will be doubling down on attacks that can impact those specific areas because that ultimately is what's going to elevate Iran's position in potential further negotiations down the line. I would also expect, continuing on that thought, I would also expect those threat groups targeting critical infrastructure and, going deeper into OT as a kind of second layer, because that ultimately is how they can also broaden the scope. And, Iran might not have the same capability to bomb, other countries, but they can definitely attack critical infrastructure and affect, and create impact that way. So that'll be another area where I'll potentially look for what will be next. And we've already touched a little bit on AI, but like I would only expect that, underlying capability to just fueling those attacks and just making the scope of the attacks even more impactful over time, because as much of those workflows are being automated, as much of those workflows are being embedded and operating at AI speed, those groups, with the amount of groups involved, they can create much bigger impact. So as that conflict continues, those will be the areas where I would definitely see some potential avenue of how that could play out.
No, that makes a huge amount of sense. And like I said, the terrifying thing in my brain is just the speed of AI. One just follow-up question from that and from my brain. Anything you in threat intelligence has seen from previous conflicts which we can compare? Like we think it could go this way, we've seen it before, or
From previous Iranian conflict or other conflicts or in
just any
general?
conflict worldwide, really? Have we seen, obviously the oil and gas is a very much a potential here, but are the playbooks similar? Have we seen similar things before?
I think in a way, what I would say is that like what we're seeing is that like each entity that gets enmeshed in a conflict. When we look at Ukrainian and Russia war, we're seeing similarity in terms of like there's usually some form of strategic objective. There's usually some form of strategic interest and impact that certain entity can have, and that's where they usually double down during the conflict. That's where all the attention goes. So when we look at like, the conflicts, whether it's Ukraine and Russia, for instance, like Ukrainians being able to pretty much bring the war back to Russians so they can put pressure on Russian population to pretty much end the conflict, was one of their ways in which they try to kind of shift the table on this conflict. And this is potential playbook that I would envision happening as well in this particular conflict between Iran and Israel, where it's more about like, okay, we're already bringing this war back to you, not in the form of actual war, but the impact of the war and making you pay for it, making you pay more for it, making your economy to struggle. So I think what we should only expect is like, if this is about survival, it's pretty much, all bets are off. And I do believe that right now for as it is for Ukraine or as it is for Iran, it is about survival. And ultimately, when that becomes the core mission, then there's pretty much no limits. So when you have someone in that corner, then we should expect pretty much doubling down on everything that they already been doing, and then from there, even depending on how bad they're cornered, even going a little bit off the typical playbook. So I don't think at a more tactical level, there's nothing pre-established, but at the high level, like usually it comes down to like what is this high level geopolitical playbook that they have, and they will just pretty much continue executing on that as well as they can.
Okay, no, that's great. Thanks for that. One other question came in, probably for both of you, but if I start with you, Paddy, do you think most organizations truly understand how exposed they are through identity and email today? Or is there still a major awareness gap at the leadership level?
I think the security team understands the exposure. I do think there's a challenge of being able to communicate that with the right level of urgency at a leadership level. So we are in 2026. We are barraged with AI everything, and we still are challenged with being able to get email security right and identities. So is it still, it's probably been a little bit of communicating it over and over and over again. I think the challenge is evolving the conversation with the evolving threat landscape. If you can tie it to what's happening today across the world, perhaps you can get more of a foothold into the financials that you need to be able to invest appropriately. I do think there's still a challenge at the leadership level, but I also think that technology today, if we put our hands on the right technology, can actually put it into simplistic terms where we can start generating the right level of metrics and reports to show how bad it really is, and then get the right level of attention from the senior leadership teams.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think certainly my experience recently talking to multiple organizations, if they don't see it, it's not a problem, right? And when they finally see results of, hey, this is everything that's still bypassing traditional either identity or email security controls, that's typically quite a big eye opener for the board. Um, Piotr, from a defense perspective, I'm sure you're very aware of email being a problem and all the rest of it, but when you speak to other people in your role, has it been a problem pushing up to your CISO and board level to get uh, more reserves to fix this as a problem, or are they still, like Patty was saying, resistant to change in some of those areas?
I think for email specifically, email is a very interesting avenue because I think it's been for so long, and the attacks, inside of a coming through email has been so known, that I think it's I would hope that and from my experience in most of programs, like pretty much like, okay, I need to secure email, I need to secure my endpoint, and then I need to, it's almost like you block it out as like email, endpoint, and then like, some form of cloud or whatever is here, or identity. But it's usually like one of those more priority items that you put forward to be able to like to protect. I think ultimately what it comes down to is really a conversation about like how well those defenses that you have are able to protect from the threats and from the attacks that are happening, especially at that age of convergence where we are, when technology, AI, and security kind of is now evolving. So I think like some of the experiences that I have and conversations that I've been with when it comes to CISOs, is more about understanding like, I do the stack that I currently have that is protecting me from email-based threats is enough? And should I be actually, relying on just one piece of it, or maybe have some form of supplementary protection in place so you can offset and offload that risk as well? And as we expand into other areas, it ultimately becomes about like, okay, how can I provide glue between those different entities that I'm protecting, and whether based on my risk profile and whether based on my on my understanding of threats and where I operate, is like, is this like the key area that someone can get access and someone can establish initial access to my environment? And in most cases, email is that form of access. Like there's no denying it that like still, even after all those years, email is, how attackers usually get the initial access to the environment. So I think that's usually where I see that's usually where I see, in conversations with CISOs and other leaders, where they focus and how they can secure funding for that ultimately comes down to how they look at the risk and how they understand the return on investment in that specific area when it comes to attacks and the threats that we're seeing.
Okay, no, thank you. That's really good to see it from your perspective. I think last question before I get into it, Patti, more probably for you. Are you seeing executives and boards becoming more engaged in cyber preparedness because of geopolitical tensions, or is it still seen as a security or an IT issue?
No, I think there's been a huge shift, and it's probably been over the last year to 2 years that we've seen this larger shift where the executives are much more engaged, um, largely because they're being targeted, and not just targeted in the office, but they're being targeted personally. Their families are being targeted. Um, there's a lot of uh, nuances. So an executive might get a ransom, pay this, and they're like, no, we're not paying the ransom. And the threat actors will go after their kids in college, their kids in high school. If they've got a social media footprint, it makes them all, unfortunately, a target. And so you've got more human psychology happening today than before. And I think people are much more dialed into it than previously. And technology is the way these messages get crafted and get sent. So I do think that executives and boards are becoming much more focused on what's actually happening in cybersecurity. I don't know that they all understand it, but they're certainly attempting to. And I'll just use my famous line is, I don't understand why boards always want a metric on how many people failed a phishing test, a phishing simulation, but it's top of mind. And I think it's because it's something that's easy for them to grasp and understand. And when you start getting into mean time to respond to a security event, that's starting to get into techno babble that they don't understand. So, keep pushing that boulder up the hill, keep working on what you're reporting and how you're communicating it to your board and your executives.
Perfect. Okay. I think we've overrun a little bit, but one thing I think makes a lot of sense, both Patti and Piotr, maybe what's the one actionable takeaway you would leave our audience with? Piotr, start with you.
One actionable takeaway to leave our audience with. I think what I would say is that as we're looking at threats originating from this conflict specifically, the playbook of potentially looking at one threat actor and X amount of techniques or tools is not really something that can be leveraged, because we have incredible amount of groups, incredible amount of attacks and capabilities that is out there, that is ultimately targeting organizations who are worried about this specific threat. So when I think about one tactical thing, it's really, to my previous point, is like, going back to basics and really understanding where is your exposure, where you don't have your hygiene today, where do I have my gaps in detection, and how quickly am I able to respond and remediate, and to Patty's previous point, also recover, because I didn't mention that before, how quickly you can recover from that. So ultimately, it's an opportunity to leverage this conflict in conversations with your board, but also with your security team, to really take a hard look at where your security program is. And now is the time to cover the gaps.
Perfect. Patti, one quick one from you.
I don't think I can, I don't think there's anything that Piotr didn't cover that I would say. So just know your weaknesses, know your risk profile, and make sure that you're communicating that in a clear, concise way with your leadership team.
Perfect. Thank you both very much, both for your time and expertise. I know it's very much appreciated by me and the rest of the team. There will be a recording available very soon. And for everyone that was listening, stay safe out there. Thanks very much, everyone.